understand intercultural adaptation, we first need to discuss the different types of migrants. Migrants are classified by two categories: the motivation for the migration and the duration of the migration. If a person's migration is voluntary, they are called either a sojourner if their migration is short, or an immigrant if their migration is long. If a person's migration is involuntary or forced, they are called either a short-term or a long-term refugee. There are two different approaches to understanding intercultural adaptation: the interpretive approach and the critical approach. The first approach to cultural adaptation is the critical approach. The critical approach states that context is very important to how well a person is able to adapt to a new culture. Some cultures are more homogeneous and not as accepting of foreigners, whereas others are more diverse and accepting of migrants. Collectivist cultures like Japan emphasize homogeneity and conformity, so outsiders that seem out of place are often unwelcome. In contrast, countries like the United States are highly individualistic and emphasize diversity, so they are much more welcoming of foreigners. The interpretive approach uses detailed, in-depth descriptions of the adaptation process. Unlike the social science approach, the interpretive approach places a heavy emphasis on the continuous nature and complexity of the cultural adaptation. The interpretive approach uses the U and W curve models to explain the different stages of adaptation. Now let's talk about the U-curve model.
The first stage of the U-curve model is known as the honeymoon phase, in which the individual is optimistic and excited for the new experiences in a foreign country. The individual hasn't experienced any culture shock yet, because the novelty aspect hasn't worn off. Once they're in the new country for long enough, they experience the crisis and culture shock stage of the U-curve model. This is characterized by feeling homesick and isolated. It's a very stressful stage for a person, because they are unfamiliar with the local culture and may not even speak the vernacular language, which often hinders adjustment to the new culture. Once a person recovers from the culture shock stage, they regain their adjustment to the new country and have effectively settled in to their new home.
Although many people find the U-curve model generally describes their experiences abroad, it does have limitations. Many people believe the U-curve model more or less describes their experiences in a new country, but many others believe it generalizes too much. Many individuals feel as though they experience a pattern and series of emotional highs and lows in which they feel adjusted to the new country, but still experience multiple culture shock stages. Long-term migrants especially find that they experience a series of U-curves with multiple stages of highs and lows, not just one curve like the U-curve model states. The U-curve model also doesn't account for the culture shock returnees experience when they go back to their home country after being away from home. Additionally, not everyone goes through culture shock, and the amount and intensity of culture shock can vary a lot based on several factors. These factors include time spent in a foreign country and willingness to communicate. The other model used by the interpretive approach is the W-curve model. To address the limitations of the U-curve model, a new model called the W-curve model was created to reflect a more realistic series of stages that migrants experience while staying in a new country. The W-curve is more realistic because it acknowledges that cultural adaptation is a long process with many highs and lows of emotions and adjustment satisfaction. As you can see in the diagram, the W-curve model accounts for multiple stages of adjustment as well as multiple culture shock stages, whereas the U-curve model does not account for multiple stages or re-entry culture shock. So let's summarize what we just covered in this video. Migrants are categorized by the motivations for the migration and the duration of their migration. People migrate either voluntarily or involuntarily, which is often due to socio-political conflicts. Migration is either short-term or long-term. Voluntary migrants are called sojourners or immigrants, and involuntary migrants are called refugees. The two different approaches to cultural adaptation are the critical approach and the interpretive approach. The critical approach emphasizes the importance of context and how a person will experience a new culture and how well they will be able to adapt. A collectivist country will usually be unwelcome to foreigners, while an individualistic, diverse country like the US will be much more receptive. The interpretive approach uses detailed, in-depth descriptions of a person's experience living in a new country. It uses the U and W curve models to explain the adaptation process. The U-curve model describes the different stages of satisfaction while living in a foreign country. It's accurate, but it's too simplistic and doesn't include the multiple stages of adjustment and culture shock most people experience when abroad. The W-curve model was created to resolve the limitations of the U-curve model and present a more realistic summary of the adaptation process. It includes multiple adjustment and culture shock stages, whereas the U-curve model does not. Together, the U and W curve models help form the interpretive approach to cultural adaptation, which is characterized by detailed, in-depth descriptions of a person's experiences living in a new country.